This is U.S. History Regents Review, Unit 2, video number 5. We're going to discuss the women's rights movement. This is the antebellum era we're discussing. So this is the period leading up to the Civil War, when women start to organize and fight for rights for the first time as a group. Most of these women actually met through getting involved with reform, fighting for abolition. The abolition movement, again, is the fight to abolish slavery. So many of these women got involved through their churches and other societies and organizations to end slavery. And through that process, many of them realized the rights that they themselves lacked. So overall, we talk about this movement as the fight to increase the rights of women. Early on, the major concerns were property rights. Women who got married typically lost official ownership of their property. That's why we have the practice of last names that are the husband's last name. The woman essentially becomes part of the husband's family and property. Women seeking divorce rights. This includes the ability to divorce and also access to children after a divorce. And then ultimately, this movement works towards voting rights. This term is also called suffrage. And the first major women's rights convention took place in New York State, upstate New York, in Seneca Falls. The Seneca Falls Convention, here's a sketch of it over here, was the first convention that discussed these rights, and ultimately, after some debate, decided that they were going to push for women's right to vote. And at this convention, they signed the Declaration of Sentiments in 1848, written by Elizabeth Cady Stanton with Lucretia Mott, that declared that all men and women are created equal. Elizabeth Cady Stanton later met Susan B. Anthony, and they famously partnered together. Cady Stanton had a large family she was taking care of, but she would do a lot of the writing while Susan B. Anthony would do a lot of the speaking, going out on tour. And ultimately, Anthony is actually arrested for voting illegally in Rochester in 1872 after Black men gave the right to vote, but women did not. A bunch of women went out, they challenged this, they organized against this, and tried to prove that citizenship rights also meant voting rights. They together formed the National Woman Suffrage Association, one of the major groups that fought for women's rights to vote. Now we're going to have document time. We're going to take a look at the Declaration of Sentiments, again by Elizabeth Cady Stanton from 1848. She writes, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed." Now, so far, this should sound super familiar. Yes, this should sound exactly like the Declaration of Independence. It is almost copying it. Now, why would she do that? She is trying to prove a point. She is trying to show the readers that women also are still fighting for their own rights. They're fighting against a different kind of tyranny. While men enjoyed the revolution and the freedoms and liberties that came with it, women really did not. So she's taken that to show the hypocrisy of the United States, just like we saw Frederick Douglass do in his speech, What to the Negroes, the 4th of July. So the only thing she's changed so far is that all men and women are created equal. And then in this next section, she says, just like the original Declaration, the history of mankind is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations on the part of man towards woman, having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over her. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. And then the document goes on to list different ways that men have taken away the rights of women. And some of these things include the right to vote. They include educational opportunities, opportunities for employment outside of the home, opportunities and a say in church. These are some of the major concerns that pop up throughout the document. So this is a really famous, important document. It could be referenced on your exam. But you should know that this is really the start of that movement. But it continues for a really long time because women do not gain the right to vote for another 70 years. Now we're going to switch over to talking about westward expansion, which is also starting to happen around this time. So think about, we discussed Andrew Jackson and Indian removal. There was territory that we had out west, like the Oklahoma Territory, which was called Indian Territory, part of the Louisiana Purchase. But we also start believing in this concept called manifest destiny. It means it's the obvious destiny, the belief that is the God-given right and destiny for the United States to expand westward. And here's that really famous painting we love to show you as history teachers, where you see this woman who is going from east to west, and we can see other things following her. We see farmers going out west, settlers out in wagons. We see the Native Americans running away with the buffalo. We see her laying down telegraph lines. She herself is doing it. So progress, Christianity, education are all moving west, and they're represented by light. It's a good thing. God has blessed us, especially as Americans, to go forth and take land and bring the civilization to everyone else. It connects with the idea that America is special, sometimes called American exceptionalism. So Americans kind of had this idea in mind. They looked to the Pacific coast and said, this will be ours someday. Even though countries like Spain controlled parts of these territories, Great Britain owned some of this territory, Mexico owned some of it, we still saw it and assumed it would become ours. And ultimately it did. For example, in Texas, a lot of Americans had moved to this area that was controlled by Mexico. Our government encouraged that. And eventually, Mexico started to oppose that. There were a lot of Americans living in their territory. And eventually, the Texans had their own revolution and claimed independence from Mexico and fought against Mexico. So the phrase, remember the Alamo, is when Mexican troops attacked the Alamo and all the Texans died. But eventually, Texas becomes independent and they decide to be annexed by the United States. And this all happens under President James K. Polk. So he annexes Texas. And then when we continue to have issues with Mexico, they don't really like that we've taken Texas. We fight this war. It's called the Mexican-American War. And we gain this chunk of land called the Mexican Cession. You can see right here on the map. In the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, one of the best named treaties ever, we get this chunk of land. American settlers, they keep moving further and further west, looking for what they see as opportunities. A lot of the American dream. You can have your own land, you can have independence, and you can be far away from the government, be a man, individualism. A lot of these ideals go with the idea of westward expansion. So again, if you look at this map at our acquisitions, we got the Louisiana Territory back in 1803, but eventually we keep moving further west. We get Texas after the independence they declare. We negotiate with Canada, Great Britain, and get Oregon country. And then we gain the Mexican Cession after the Mexican-American War. Eventually, we get the Gadsden Purchase. That's something that we bought. You might hear the phrase fought or bought for all this land. We bought this because they wanted to build a railroad through here. That did not end up happening. However, along with new territory brought conflict and compromise. And I put a bunch of question marks there because we're going to see these, quote, compromises happen, but they're not going to satisfy anyone. So aside from the conflict with the Native Americans, which we'll talk about more in the next unit, there's this huge conflict every time we get new territory about whether that state is going to become a free state or a slave state. This issue repeats itself every single time we create these new states. And the first compromise that they create is called the Missouri Compromise, 1820. So if you look up here, here's a map of that. Here's where Missouri is. They decide that they're going to add Missouri as a slave state. They add Maine as a free state. And then they draw this line called the Missouri Compromise line. And they decide that from now on, any new states created north of the line will be free and south of the line will be slave territory. This is supposed to be the first compromise of many to satisfy both sides.